So my name is Zev Kirsch, and this is going to be a summary of my watching of the Network State event in Amsterdam. That was Balaji's production. Big fan, love Balaji. I haven't really met him, but I like his work, and read the Network State. I've been into the sovereign city stuff for a long time, and just sort of thinking on a lot of the matters that what's wrong and what could be done better. And Balaji came along with the sort of mind, spirit, resources, and vision to rebrand and also just add brand the network state on top of all these ideas. And then, of course, all the technology has come along the way. So I am going to just start describing because I really haven't seen any good descriptions. And I didn't really, to be honest, look, like these are my descriptions of what the speakers are. So in part two, and I'll have to, I guess, edit this. But I'm going to go through a bunch of speakers, and there's so many that I really wanted to go through. Glenn Greenwald, who's like a favorite of mine, he's really great. He came on and he talked about the challenges of decentralizing video platforms. I don't think he mentioned Odyssey. He mentioned Rumble. And he just said that that's really decentralized. Media is going to be the solution for sort of the propaganda state that he describes exists, and I think most people agree with on some level. And you can't have freedom without free media, because you can't get truth without at least stoic disinterestedness in the news. If and some people disagree about that. Actually, Rinsberg came on after and he assumes that network state is the ultimate solution to everything, and he talks about disintermediation in terms of media, but his real focus was on fact checking and why decentralized fact checking with like a middleman of the swarm or crowd that somehow is better. Whether it's Twitter or, I think ultimately he would want a decentralized a swarm. It's going to be a different media platform arrangement as what we saw in the past, which was that reporters give you the truth. Now there's fact checkers, but of course we know there's a huge problem with fact checking and with that. But it's interesting to go into that to say that there's a potential for keeping things more kosher in terms of media and understanding that process. Alana Newhouse was very quick. Her basic, observation was that there's really two camps at the extremes of status quo people who are institutionalists, pro-institutionalists, and the brokenists who think they're not. And that's parallel media. I don't know exactly how, possibly with decentralized technology and incentive schemes could help solve this for the brokenness. She doesn't really go into the fact if there can be a reproach. Presumably, history has actual schisms and splits, but is there a place for the status quo and brokenness people to come together? And that's another question she didn't really talk about. Mr. Yassin of Nas Daily, he was one of my favorite in the last few of people. He talks about the growth marketing mindset and how that's his thing. He bragged about being good at it, but what he says is that ultimately, when the money dies off because the incentive schemes allow the gatekeeper to just create artificial scarcity, you get nothing left in social media. There's no money left in it. Why? Because the creator class, which is sort of their money's taken away, and their connection, and the community class, which is the people they're serving. So, he talks about disintermediating this, making decentralized, let's say, content, but not just content, but methodologies of bringing creator and community together, ultimately through incentives, through eliminating the middleman, essentially, and why that will explode. And he says it already is, perhaps, and that one day, a real network state or a real sort of, let's say, common values, nearly religiously minded common values community, a real network state may emerge, and first it would start off as a cloud-based network state, as one of these content creator and community platforms that allows people to connect. I thought that was an interesting way of describing an emergent possibility. Mr. Romero from Farcaster also, with specificity, Yes, Knopf Daily was about all of the different social media. Romero was talking about, his idea of, I guess, the social graph, social media, and how decentralizing that specifically is also interesting. But whether it looks like Instagram or this or that or the other, YouTube or then Crispin Frank of Synthesis came on, and I really enjoyed his talk. It was sort of a broader talk about tutoring and education, how important that is. And his partner, Benjamin Bloom, involved in creating schools for Elon Musk and people around that area. I guess in Austin, or it could have been previously in LA, but SpaceX people having sort of private schooling. And, the big thing now being the basic sociological observation that always best to have a tutor, right? Aristotle was a great tutor, and some sort of digital Aristotle could be in the making to help schools become far more effective at what they're doing, and also at making people smarter and learning better and automating the autodidacticism of learning, which is a lot of learning, but also perhaps merging it into a schooling process with a social component, and really optimizing for that. And I think that is super interesting. He mentioned a DARPA project, Less Wrong Tutor, I think that's there's a lot there, and that's important. And I don't know how much of that is decentralized, or to what extent it's important to decentralize certain components of that process. But any gamification, of course, authentication, perhaps, the decentralized message is there. But I'm a huge fan of discussing education reform, because ultimately, I would say that one of the guiding assumptions of a lot of these talks is that decentralization is fundamentally a good. Why? Because you're creating we talk about the swarm and the group, and it's very good, to distinguish between those swarms and groups that are centrally controlled, by a unitary intention, and those that are actually able to be disintermediated, such that people in that group can act more like individuals because their incentives are being attended to directly. They're the gatekeeper, so to speak, or the single owner of a large group, the centralized a node of a group. If they gain too much control, essentially corrupt the system, bastardize it, and produce a lower quality. That's not always the case. That's a big assumption. And sometimes it's forgotten that there are also just like lateral concerns of how swarms operate, whether decentralized or centralized. But the guiding presumption here between a lot of these talks are that there's something much better, safer, or not necessarily even safer, but more authentic and makes for better possibilities. And with education at the individual level, we're not really talking about the swarm anymore, but you're turning perhaps a group of children who normally have to be in a centralized setting, you're disintermediating the process of them being able to teach themselves a little bit, such that they can spend more time teaching themselves and maybe make more meaningful time when they're with others, perhaps. Or maybe it's not a matter of more or less, but just having a better quality of autodidacticism and changing the model. And this is common even well before any talk of decentralization. There's Montefiore schools, there's different things about how people learn. Super important, especially if you're going to be aspiring towards teaching people, to think and be smart and stuff. And like, I'll get to that actually later, and that connects me to something really great that Cody Sanchez said. She's number 20, and I'll just bring her in here at this point, because you have a guy like Crispin coming from a place of talking about the elite, Elon Musk, wanting to teach people better. But the reality is we all want more resources, and that a technology shift might make everyone more elite when it comes to education, from the bottom to the top. And it doesn't really matter if you're getting snarky about how many languages you speak and this and that. But so Cody Sanchez, her main message, and she speaks much later, and it's a really great message, is that, you're going to need this parallel finance world if you want it to succeed, to work for the blue collar economy, because any real set of projects that succeed, let alone a city, is going to need a lot of people to maintain the systems. Maintenance of many different varieties and types is considered sort of lesser work, blue collar work, more rote work. And yet plenty blue collar people that do this work. It's just people need to make a living. Some of these people are geniuses, even the ones that aren't. And they're just everybody that just does their job and makes it succeed. They're essentially they're voting by being. if they come to your project, then you're blessed. That may make your project successful. The ones that she says will succeed are the ones that actually attract and keep this idea of blue collarness. And, between the elite of Mr. Crispin and the blue collar of Cody, there's got to be a room for both, but there also has to be a real synthesis between the idea that both owe and are part of the same system. And this will come back to, so not just social contract in some sort of very proximate and or distal sense, impersonal sense, but this will come to how people live together in a religious sense where they feel close to one another. Not 100% regardless of perhaps education or class status or other things, but mostly regardless, because people are people, and if they're working on a common real project that's going to be successful, they need to be thinking together. Okay, so I went up ahead and I skipped a little bit to Cody. I'll come back. So Michael Gibson, he talks about the 1617 fund as a sort of anti Harvard or like anti-conventional snobbery, conventional education fund, and that he gives out money. And he had a nice talk, but yeah. So Tyler Cowan, a professor of economics, then speaks. He's from Emergent Ventures, and his, I guess, thing that he does with Alex Tabcock is he has a university called Marginal Revolution University. I guess all or most materials are free, but his goal is to debureaucratize philanthropy, or that's what he's doing with his Emergent Ventures. And I guess that means just making better decisions, I suppose, or I don't know, for giving away money. I don't know how they do that. It'd be very interesting to find out more, actually. Amjad Masad comes out. He's the founder of Replit. That I want to learn more about that. I've heard of Replit many times. I didn't really get the total connection between decentralized apps, but then again, Replit is a coding platform essentially, and it allows people to not only code but learn how to code both. That's obviously it's a top platform for AI coding or making coding simpler. I don't think it is it's not a no code. It's very much a code based platform. But it seems interesting. I didn't really get into the nitty gritty of how or who's using it, but I'm sure a lot of people are in DeFi, all the decentralized areas. Gary Tan then came on, head of Y Combinator, and he really emphasized why San Francisco is still great at a time where everyone's kind of literally shitting on San Francisco, and metaphorically. It's really nice actually to hear from someone and be like, you know what? It's still a great place to be where smart people should be. He almost sort of alludes to New York City as being another great place. I'm from New York. I grew up here when it was just coming out of the really bad times, but even a little bit before. And I've seen some really bad stuff in the streets of New York City. And some people say they're seeing it now, but I still love the city. What bothers me about it is not necessarily that stuff, actually. It's actually what's going on at the city level that's causing that stuff, right? It's the same stuff that's causing people to flee New York, and to make New York just much more expensive. We're talking about all sorts of taxes and fees coming down the line for whatever justification. New York is becoming more expensive to operate. There's always going to be a rationalization, and that's causing a lot of the mess. And it's sad when people abandon a city. When you get a brain drain, the city can go bad too. So I love Gary's message, and he's talking about whatever comes, whatever level of institutional replacement comes, it's going to be internet based at first. So if the cloud gets off, the network state will get off as a cloud state is what he's saying, which is a common theme. And, we'll see how it goes. So then an oddly named Bef Bezos, sounds like the guy either changed his name or uses his stage name. In order to, play off of Jeff Bezos, he just switches the first letters of each word in the name. And he talks about effective accelerationism. And effective accelerationism, I'm sorry, Mr. Bef Bezos. I like you. I like all people here, actually, at these network state conferences. I really do. But I'm going to have to go after this guy. Sometimes I'm going to be hard on people. And I'm not always Mr. Nice Guy. I'm almost never that in reviewing, which is why I probably shouldn't review too much. But Mr. Bef Bezos, along with his name kind of being a pun, his idea of so-called cybernetics, he talks about a lot of ideas that have been around the block for decades in sci-fi, and he dresses up some jargon in them, which is a nice alarm bell to ring. But essentially, effective altruism, effective acceleration, say what you want about these named philosophies, but they're just materialism in a different dress up, right? The common values of everything will get better because of technology. No, that is incorrect, or at least not the most useful way of really thinking about it. The most useful way of thinking about this existential question, which is what you're really getting at, and you're a little young to be discussing it, but not necessarily. The real question is, what is the material? The material is us, right? We are the technology is in us, is our minds, our consciousness, our memories, and our communal level of communication. And without something really emphasizing that we are the spirit, and that we use technology, we build a world around us together, and that there's an existential spirit connecting us, then you cannot found any idea of good in anything meaningful. To say that, well, everything's going to be great and everything in the future should be based around technology and acceleration, you just sound like very typical techno utopian, and that's problematic. But he does mention, he does have a good idea. So I'm gonna emphasize something he said that's very good, which is that the network state, really the key technology, because there's so many involved for the network state, and the progress of what it will become, which obviously pattern recognition, and AI, and information processing automation are going to be a huge part, right, of all this. So what does that mean? It means the decentralized cloud is going to be very important, because he who controls the cloud controls everything, right? If you're the one with the keys, you can eventually create the scarcity, right? You can create the artificial scarcity, which is the problem. This disintermediation will then untangle this problem. And so we have to focus on cloud decentralization. And I think that's actually really great to talk about. There's a lot of technical discussion about what's going on with decentralized processing, rendering, memory, this, that. I mean, there's a ton of it on the technical side. But his discussion of cybernetics and all this is much to be desired. And I think not to challenge him is wrong, but I'd love to see him speak with people that bring other ideas about that paradigm of so-called progress, and of all types. Like, I'm not espousing a Luddite view here, or an anti-technological view, but humans are the spirit in my view, and then technology is the result, and the thing that's controlled. And then, of course, there's feedback loops. It controls us. So Spencer McDonald of Spearbit Cantina, he was actually one of my favorite speakers. And I think one of the most underrated speakers. He's an Army officer, which makes me actually extremely curious to hear more from him. And Patrice Friedman, he discusses the fact that he hung out with Patrice Friedman, and his major observation is like, look, you have a lot of things that account for what we call security. And his overall theme is like, look, of course, you're going to want to piggyback, like a lot of people say, piggyback on services and other things. You got to piggyback on the military. It's too expensive to have a total standing army. And look, decentralized state or not, look at the UN. There's like 180 nations. 100 of them simply don't have any army. They might say they do, but effectively they don't. And there are about 100 nations in the world, which I think right now you could effectively call network states that have land. And not great network technology, right? So you could maybe just service them and turn them all into a bunch of federated network states. I mean, I'm sure it's being done, right? Everybody's copying the Estonia digital platform. But anyway, point of him saying this is he doesn't just say, oh, well, you're not going to have an army. And okay, you can accept that. You're sort of an aspiring network state is a special economic zone ultimately. But with what kinds of security economies? Who are you going to pay for your private messaging? Who are you going to pay for private everything? Even people talk about private financial systems, and that's not his expertise, but he talks about Kali and Lexdow and some other financial systems that basically security of the data. How are you going to keep everything secure? On top of that, security of the land, right? You got to keep your servers secure, or if they're not yours, there's software security, but you got to keep your land secure. And he talks about public safety, and not everything can be done by cryptography and drones. Maybe that can be the cheap, scalable way of being the primary means of defense, but fences and other things are still needed, unfortunately. And how digital can you get while being robust and still having a real flesh incarnate security system? You can call it your blue collar security system if you want. I don't know, but people have to really do these things. And his observations on the military about human machine teaming are very interesting. How, you want to make robust systems where it's really human based, but machines maybe help. you can't nuke the network, but people are very vulnerable. He really talks about this real life reality if you're going to have a territory as a network state. And what I really love, I wish he would have addressed this, is that it's not either or. And this is the model that I really wanted people to talk about more, and I'll get to it. It's that physical territory doesn't need to be a special economic zone yet. It doesn't need to be X, Y, and Z. And while it is that thing in the future, potentially, where is the cultivation of this physical territory? And it's everywhere. Just because you have a network state somewhere doesn't mean a person who isn't deeply involved can't make use of their property or house. Or like a Masonic lodge, a bunch of people come together and you have an area that's your meeting house or temple or church or whatever, legally speaking. It's a place where people come together and then they implement this idea of network state in a very real, meaningful, like real world territorial sense, and security and other things. Who knows? To me, that's very important. And being in New York, I've been a little disappointed to see that like Praxis hasn't really gotten a local scene going. They're not saying anything totally negative about them, but that there's nothing in New York, and that's where their home base is supposed to be. So I'm waiting. I don't think you need some major center in New York or a big real estate expenditure, right? You don't want to keep your burn rate high, but you can get people together and you can have centers and stuff. And it's like a senior center or this center or a network state center, or, Praxis is one, but for people in New York in general. And I thought who knows? That's actually something I'm going to write down right now, so I don't forget. I got to talk to Nick Casamides. That's a joke. He was a well-known Bitcoin center guy in New York City. Like to rent locations. So, okay. So Spencer is done. Obviously you can tell I had a little bromance with Spencer's talk, because he really does talk about reality, and he talks about the campus police model, and, it's like sort of, and he talks about statesmen, and he sort of has a sense of the real world sort of sociology a little bit, and so does a few of the next people too. So I'm going to keep on going. Lewis, I forgot his last name, of Aragon. He built one of the first, I think, amazing DAO platforms for hosting DAOs, and I think he has one for sovereign organizations and also sovereign individual. He talks about citizenship and passports and why they're very important. I think his current company's name is called Baseflow, and there are sticky parts and problems with passports and citizenship. But what he's really talking about, and you could say it in the nice way, which is providing an asset, building asset wealth in terms of where your passport is, but he really the nice way is like, look, we live in a jungle of a world, and like it's good to have freedom, whether it's your passport. Why? Because taxes are implicated. So, but then he talks about citizenship by purchase and other things, which this is like a huge area, and it has some crossover with the decentralized idea of sovereignty and a network state as it applies to just existing countries. But the reality is countries are competing. They're selling their citizenship so that you can buy tax advantages, and to the extent, but there's also physical place that you can go. So you're buying a lot there. It really is a discussion of that, in my opinion. So next, Mark Lutter from the Charter Citizen Institute. Super, super great talk. And he really brings a very deep and profound wisdom to the understanding of network state and what it really came from, which was sovereign state, and what it really comes from. Not just these descriptions of names of movements, which have always existed. It's a movement for people to have freedom and excellence and independence and the ability to pursue good. That's what all of this is really about. And people have different ideas about that. Now that there's technology, it's making things really interesting, but it's really hard, often chaotic, to think about these things. The internet is actually allowing all of us to come together. Maybe new decentralized technologies are allowing people to actually practice and act together, not just exchange ideas and find one another. And thus, these chaotic, kind of crazy ideas allow a bunch of people who otherwise in the past, now they can bring these chaotic ideas together and convene on them, and maybe these will become reality. I'm reminded of Balaji's discussion about the Jewish state, or the Jewish state or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I read that. It's a Zionist book by Herzl, and it's like there's a lot of sociology behind how these things happen, and it's not really discussed enough. I mean, I think because there's such a plethora of people discussing network state possibilities, they don't realize that it's been done before many times or tried, and there's a lot of wisdom in the problems and challenges and opportunities. And Mark Letter is clearly aware of these things, right? He comes off as like a spook-like bureaucrat, in my opinion, which is really I'm trying to make that actually. I think in these groups it would be thought of as negative, but I'm saying that as a positive, right? With wisdom and stoicism and purposefulness. So he's a professor at George Mason, or he got his PhD there. He talks, he mentions a lot of things, how governance is really what matters, right? And so he pulls through a lot of interesting issues, right? Special interest groups are a problem in society. How do you deal with the governance of self-dealing and stopping imploding negative feedback loops, including fraud and a bureaucracy and self-dealing? He talks about the neo-colonial idea of high-income countries sponsoring lower poor countries as not such a great network state idea. And maybe it just hasn't worked yet, but that's a certain idea of how network states could be had, and never really worked. That was Paul Romer's idea, at least up until this point. I don't think that's the reason it didn't work. And then he talks about the seasteading, which is like kind of not so interesting. The seasteading era, which I was acutely aware of what was going on there, and actually during that era, I did a lot of my own research and reading. I was never a big fan of seasteading, having briefly had the displeasure of owning a sailboat and having to maintain it. And then I also read probably the most interesting seasteading thing I read about was just like biomineralization, where you could like maybe create sort of land not organically, but through a continuous process. And the best place to do it was like the Indian Ocean or something. Like there's some very shallow area off the Indian Ocean that was never even mentioned in the seasteading days. But certainly having like floating cities is just not a good idea. Floating things tend to break. The ocean tends to break them over time and maintenance and all sorts of things. So he goes on and he talks about the key idea here is, well, on one level, as he says, you want to get the smartest people into one place. Gary Tan sort of emphasizes that, and that is really important, getting people into the same place. Now, Cody Sanchez says, well, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You need a ton of people who can do. Now, all of these concepts don't come together all at once in practically having a physical territory that's in one place, but you can have also even in decentralized places. And what is the idea? The idea is you have a critical mass of people, the right mix of people. Let's call it the critical mix as well. People who can maintain things, people in all these skills. And then, of course, I'll come back to it later. He talks about, the history in Shenzhen, and, Shenzhen was not really a special economic zone. It was a Chinese special economic zone. They had all of the freedoms they needed to be successful. If any SEC gets absolutely all the needed things it needs, freedoms it needs to be successful, and unlimited capacity to absorb people, obviously there's eventually, just like in Prospera, going to be a problem where the local state wants a piece of the action or says whatever, interrupts. So there's something to say for full sovereignty if you want unlimited growth. But realistically, a lot of the mix of freedoms that you need to be successful also has to do with what's your cap? Can you negotiate a certain amount of people you're allowed to have, a certain amount of space you're allowed to have? Mark talks about 10,000s of acres to be enough, and piggybacking off the existing state scale infrastructure. There's a lot to worry about when you're planning out this beautiful new utopia. And I think that's great too, but in many ways, I have a lot to say about that. I could go on at length. I don't want to tangent into that subject too much, other than to say that like Neom and other startup cities, that never happened. I don't know what Bravo cities really are, but he talks about Dubai, another sort of exotic case. A new network city that might hope to be legitimate as a territory is not going to aspire to be Dubai or Shenzhen. It has to have some political backing, of course. And I think that's what's missing from a real new sort of Zion / Omega state, praxis state. But in any case, let's keep on going. I really could spend a whole video on Mark, and I know I'm taking a long time already. So then Nicholas Anzinger comes on, a friend of mine. I know him from numerous meetings. I really love the guy. He talks about the FDA, specifically health, and oh man, I could give a talk on this too. But I'm going to mix him and Lawrence Ion in the same one, and even Patrick Joyce. So Nicholas talks about the FDA being problematic. As a lawyer in the United States, having dealt with some of their stuff, yeah, it's problematic. He doesn't go into too much because why bother? It's one of the most boring subjects to actually even talk about. But what he's really emphasizing is that you can have a network state in the cloud all you want, right? But to have something that builds new technology, new magic, you have to have the physical body in a place where you can do physical treatments and physical trials on consumable treatments or other treatments that are pharmaceuticals or other types of things that go into the body, substances, treatments. And so you need a real place. And that's his basic idea. And he's like, hey, do it at Prospera for 2 months in the winter. And like, yes, thank you, please. Lawrence from Vitalia sort of follows on him. And this is, part of the same discussion, which is, is this place going to be a biomedical tourism city? Is it going to, we don't know the format of it. It might have to be for profit and nonprofit. It might have to be a lot of things, but this has to change if we're going to have a state that really builds some really exotic new biological technologies. And that will include maybe even some of the good and some of the evil. He doesn't really talk about going to the good and bad, and we don't talk about the ethics here of a new state, but it implicates religion, because biomedical ethics, what people can do to their bodies, or how people should feel about what other people think they should force on other people's bodies, right? And Lawrence didn't really, talk about this sort of burgeoning movement in the United States of sort of anti-totalitarian, anti-Gatesian people who don't want anybody telling them, pressuring them, using propaganda or otherwise, or let alone government incentives or punishments to force you to take substances into your body, right? mRNA therapy is gene therapy, is other types of experimental therapies, or even so-called non-experimental therapies, talking about what's experimental and not experimental. To begin with, everything's an experiment. So there's a lot to go in there. He doesn't really talk about this, but he does talk about death being bad. And I really want to address this. This is an important sort of pet peeve topic of mine. And so it's one thing to aspire for a health span and longevity. And it's very important that we do, right? It's vital that we do. This is part of who we are. And it's, I think, something to talk about further. I'll mention it later. But telling people they're not going to die, or that they can hope not to die, is also denying something which is very important in life, which is about establishing common meaning with people. Common meaning can come from common joy, but it can also come from common suffering. Meaning often comes from suffering, and the most trying realities of getting people to be together as human beings is about finding a way for them to sort of commune and make meaning out of that process of being together with their pain, right? Dying together, grief, feeling someone's grief. To say that, you should want to live forever, or that dying is a disease or a wrong, is to deny the meaning-making process for someone who's actually dying as we speak right now, or who is suffering from someone else's death right now. And so it's really important, and words are important. Cody Sanchez talks about this. It's really important, and I'm almost like begging people, because the language with which we use, and you talk about, lots of great people like Brian Johnson, the language with which we use is often not as important as the activity which we're doing, which is, in this area, people want to live healthier, live better. They want other people to live healthier, live better. The actions are what's important. It's coming from a good place, but some of the attitudes that are associated with it, whatever they are, the words to describe them sometimes can offend other people. And I think specifically with longevity, because we're talking about bioethics, and the language that we discuss life and death itself, even outside of some sort of seemingly objective context, has a very subjective reality to making common meaning with people. And I'm not saying to believe in hell or to believe in alternate realities or supernaturalistic beliefs, but value is a construction. It is a psychosocial construction. It is not an island that a man makes onto himself, but people share the values and they change. And one of these values is how we discuss death. Death is so important. Today is Halloween, and I walk outside and I see so many of these skeletons everywhere, scaring the little kids. And it's playful and it's a pagan fun holiday, and I love it. And at the same time, I'm a macabre person. So I look at those skeletons and I see like just rotting corpses on them. My eyes flash. I'm like, wow, if that were the case, mothers would hide their children's eyes if we really saw death for what it was. And we should see death for what it is, at least some of the time, because some of the time we can't avoid it. It affects other people around us. It creates tremendous loss because of the attachment we have to the living and the great things about them. And that loss, it's in you whether you know it or not. Your parents experienced it almost by definition. Everyone's experienced it. It's a very human thing. It's in all of us, and how we talk about it is really important. I'm open to being wrong about some of the things I said and arguing and yada yada. Um, but anyway, Lawrence talks about that. He talks about Vitalia, and this is the you know it's the big thing coming for Prospera. So very important. Patrick Joyce follows them up talking about decentralized science, which is really, he's sort of promoting or showing you his publishing of science platform. And this is actually a subject I love. The corruption of the sciences by many different paths is very important. And it's certainly deeply connected to the corruption of the publishing of the sciences. And it's a great, great thing to talk about. Aaron Schwartz, other people really important in terms of spirit in the space. But the mechanism is less about a tokenizing or decentralization. It's ultimately, what are we trying to get out with the sciences? And how can Patrick Joyce's platform, ResearchCoin, help? Frankly, I would like it to be called something other than ResearchCoin. Anatoly Yakovenko comes on. I guess Solana founder, I believe. He's really into open finance, and he seems to be like a real technical guy, but also business economics driven. Is that ultimately the lowest common denominator here in all of our legacy economics digital systems is you have an owner, a gatekeeper. They'll render your network communication artificially scarce and thereby take away all the gains everybody could get by sharing and having an open system. The parallel systems being built by Solana, by others, and it's not just merely financial, but it's really all things communication, all things informational. And I'm adding that because it goes beyond finance, but he gives you, your typical stack of all these finance applications that are going to be decentralized and in a sense, make settlement instantaneous and cheap, and making it instantaneous and cheap renders a network just so much more valuable. And why is that? And he says, well, it's because they all have the same network state. And it's a good little pun, not a pun, what's a turn of phrase, because this is a network state conference, but he's really talking about the state of the network, right? There's a network system in all these financial systems, and they have various states. And when they're all matched, everything goes, high transaction throughput on everything. And I would go beyond that when we look at what transaction processing, information processing, all of the possibilities that are not merely commercial in nature, but personal in nature, as information could be used for the benefit, for the good of everyone. The Winklevoss twins showed up almost as if to basically give a shout out to Balaji. They said almost nothing. I love the Winklevoss twins, but they didn't really say much. Cody Sanchez already spoke, and she did a great job. I really enjoyed her speech, and she is a nice respite from the typical. She's a lovely and a wonderful addition to the group of speakers, is what I want to say. Okay, that's it for now. I'm going to continue on because I saw one that I really wanted to give attention to, which was Kathleen Tyson.